Alright guys, today we're going to be looking at the evolution of camcorders. In this video I'm going to be showing you guys how camcorders have evolved over the past 30 years, how they've gotten a lot smaller, how the recording formats have changed. So this is just a brief history of consumer camcorders after film. Through the majority of the 1900s, film was the way people captured movies onto. However, during the 1950s and 60s, the magnetic tape formats started to be introduced, like 1-inch and 2-inch tapes, things like that. They were recorded on reel-to-reel recorders. Then during the 70s, the first well-known magnetic tape format came about. That was U-matic, which was used by professionals in the industry. It was invented by Sony. And then in 1975, two formats were introduced. The Betamax format was introduced by Sony, and then the well-known VHS format was introduced by JVC. And at first there were only VCR machines available, but eventually camera units started becoming available. And in the 1980s, they made the first camcorders, which were units that combined the camera and the VCR into one unit. So this is a brief history of that. During the 1980s, most camcorders that you'd see, even the low-end consumer camcorders, would usually be something like this. Very large in size by today's standards. Back here would be the tape mechanism. In this case it's a Betamax tape mechanism. Here's the tape that records onto. You can see. Here's the beta tape. A little bit smaller than a VHS tape. I don't really need to tell you guys about VHS. Beta was popular through the 70s and 80s, but by the mid-80s it started to die out as VHS became the dominant format, and it stayed that way for several years until DVDs came about. But we're not here to talk about home video, we're here to talk about camera videos. So here's the unit. On the front we have the mechanical or the manual zoom lever, which also has a motor to mechanically zoom. And here's also the focus ring. And like I said before, in the back here is the recorder, and right here is the viewfinder. Some camcorders during the 80s had CRT viewfinders. Others, like this camcorder, had an optical viewfinder, where the image that went through the lens was split into two images. One was beamed up into the optical viewfinder for you to see. The other image, or the other part of the image, was sent here to be recorded. Here is a battery for the Betamovie camcorder. Very, very large, and it's quite heavy as well. It's nearly as large as the Sony Handycam camcorder, so it's a pretty large battery. That's how most batteries were back then. So this was how camcorders from the 1980s were. Betamax was, again, somewhat popular in the early 80s, but then it started to die out, and Sony invented two new formats during the 80s to replace Betamax. They invented Betacam, which used the same cassette as Betamax, or like a similar cassette. However, the machines were completely incompatible. A Betacam recording cannot be played back on a Betamax VCR, and a Betamax recording cannot be played back on a Betacam machine. So they used similar cassettes, but they were completely incompatible. Also, Sony invented a new format for the consumer world, Video 8, which I have right here. Here's a Video 8 tape. It's around the same size as an audio cassette, and it's one of the more well-known consumer camcorder video formats. It was used for a very long time. You can see it's a great deal smaller than the Beta cassette. And after the Video 8 format was introduced by Sony, camcorders could get a lot smaller. And around the same time, JVC, who had invented VHS, also invented s-vhs-c, which was a much smaller tape that could still be played back on a VCR with the right adapter. And both of these new formats allowed camcorders to get a lot smaller, which is where we get to this camcorder. This is a Canon ES900 Video 8 camcorder from 1996. Most of the 90s camcorders were around this size. During the 1990s, there were so many video formats that were introduced or were popular. Well through the 90s and even into the early 2000s, full-sized VHS camcorders were still being made, and then in the professional world, Betacam was still being used. Then there was s-vhs-c, Video 8, s-vhs, full-sized s-vhs, which was a higher resolution version of VHS, which used the same cassette, s-vhs-c, which was a more compact version of s-vhs. Then there was Hi 8, which was a higher quality version of Video 8. And then JVC introduced the DV codec, which was used on a lot of machines in the 90s and 2000s. And the most common DV tape format is mini DV, which was used by camcorders in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s. In fact, even in the late 2000s, they were still making mini DV camcorders. Sony made the Digital 8 format, which could record DV quality video in a digital format onto a standard Hi 8 tape. So the 90s definitely had a lot of different formats for camcorders. But here's the Canon camcorder, definitely a lot smaller than the Betamovie camcorder. And right here you can see the battery. I can get it off. Great deal smaller than that Betamovie battery was. So during the 90s, a lot of different formats were introduced and camcorders got a lot smaller. In the 2000s, camcorders continued to get smaller as technology advanced. At the same time, the transition was made from cassette tape formats over to hard drive or flash memory based formats. During the early 2000s, most of the formats that had been introduced in the 90s were still being made. Like in the early 2000s, you could still find Hi 8, Video 8, Mini DV, Digital 8. Even s-vhs-c camcorders were still being made in the early 2000s. But over the decade, that started to change. By the end of the 2000s, the only cassette tape format that was still being used was Mini DV. So the analog cassette tape formats kind of died off during the 2000s. However, the DV tape format remained popular, both in the consumer and professional industries, and it was even improved upon in the early 2000s when they invented HDV, which was high definition on a DV tape. And this format, not as popular as Mini DV, it was still used in professional and consumer camcorders all the way through the 2000s. Then in the mid-2000s, they started coming out with DVD camcorders that recorded the video onto either a full-size DVD or a mini DVD. However, these camcorders weren't very popular, and they died off fairly quickly. And by the late 2000s, and as we get into the 2010 decade, they started getting replaced with flash memory camcorders like this, that recorded the video onto an SD card, or they'll have a built-in hard drive on them. And some of them are high definition, some are standard definition in the video recording quality. And by the end of the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s, cassette tapes just died off. So that is the history of consumer camcorders.